Why should we read the Republic? I imagine lots of students ask this question to themselves when they're given it as a set book at the beginning of their university course. But in fact, there are many good reasons to read the Republic. And the first one I would pick on is just that it is immensely readable. It's not, Plato did not write philosophy like a dry textbook. He wrote it like a living conversation. The whole of the Republic, which is a fairly fat book, is a living conversation written in short, almost soundbite type answers, but nevertheless developing some very, very important ideas. So my first answer then, we should read the Republic just because it is readable. It was written by a genius and it's worth reading. It's easy to read. It's not difficult. But then there's also obviously the thought, the content of the book. And he's asking this absolutely fundamental question. Why should we bother to be good? What's in it for us, effectively? It seems, when we look at the world, it looks as though injustice pays. It looks as though crime pays, whereas the good people get trodden down. So Plato addresses this absolutely fundamental question. Why should we be good? I'm not going to tell you his answer. Read the book.
I'm 43 years old, and I owe tens of thousands of dollars in student loans. Oh, sure, I knew the loans were piling up as I went through school. But with one loan coming from here, another from there, I had no idea of the rock slide that was building. 15 years later, I still experience moments of sheer horror regarding my family's financial situation. My monthly student loan payment is more than triple my car payment. Okay, so without my college degree, I would not have been able to get my current job. For that I'm grateful, but at what cost? My loans have been accruing at a rate of 10%, and now they have burgeoned to, well, I'm an English major, you do the math. I don't think they'll ever get paid off. We're in debt way past our eyeballs, and there's no hope in sight. I'm being kept in class, a financial class of graduates whose only hope for attending college meant borrowing money from the government. Because of our mounting credit card debt and monthly payments that far exceed our family's income, my kids will also join the class of citizens who can't rely on their parents for college support. Do I wish I'd chosen another educational route? You bet. Perhaps trade school. I thought that being a plumber might not be such a bad gig. But if your job aspirations require a 4-year degree, take my advice and choose a college you can afford both during and after graduation. Take a realistic look at your anticipated income and factor in priorities that don't carry a price, like the spouse and children you might want to have someday. I was overconfident that my student loan debt would pale in comparison to the lucrative writing career I'd enjoy after graduation. Now I'm paying for that decision in more ways than I'd ever imagined.
Under appropriate conditions, mind you. Sound receptors. You've got sound receptors in your ear, and they're beautiful. We're not going to talk about them at any length, but there's little flappy, these little spiky things going along in your ear, and they can translate vibrational energy coming from your ear, hitting your eardrum, being translated into a vibration in the fluid in your ear, into a physical motion of these little receptors there into an electrical motion, into an electrical signal that goes into your ear. So all that's pretty impressive stuff. We're not going to talk about the details of it, but I invite some of you who want to learn more about this, particularly MIT students, I think, find receptors to be really quite remarkable kinds of devices.
Language death is not mainstream theatre. It is not mainstream anything. Can you imagine Hollywood taking it on? It's so far outside the mindsets of most people that they have a difficulty appreciating what the crisis is all about because they're not used to thinking about language as an issue in itself. Somehow we need to change these mindsets. We need to get people thinking more about language, more explicitly, more intimately, more enthusiastically. Interest in language is certainly there in the general population. Most people are fascinated by such topics as where words come from, or what the origin of their town's name is, or whether their baby's name means anything. And they're certainly prepared to play Scrabble and a host of other language games ad infinitum. And you get language games on radio and television too, but a willingness to focus that interest on general issues, a preparedness to take on board the emotion and drama inherent in the situation of language endangerment is not something that happens much.
Just over 10 years ago, when I was in the Royal Academy, a museum in the centre of London with my 3 children at the Aztec exhibition. I don't know if any of you saw it. I had an older child and 2 younger children. Twins is shown in this picture. And one of my children, 3 years old, shouted. And I've never denied he shouted. He shouted, "Monster." Monster? At this statue, which looked just like a monster, had snakes for hair, a big beak for a nose. And I thought, this is fantastic. I got a 3-year-old that's appreciating pre-Hispanic art. How good can it get? So I bent down. I said, yes, it looks just like a monster. And at that moment, a security guard came over. Then a gallery assistant came over and said, we're being too noisy, and threw us out. Roll the family. During that time, I was a journalist with the Guardian newspaper, and 2 days later, I wrote a big piece in the Guardian about being thrown out of the Royal Academy. And what was really interesting was by the end of that day, at the paper we had over 500 emails from other families saying museums aren't working for us. Let's try and make it work. So that's what we did in the garden. We set up a campaign for the Kids Museums campaign. It didn't really exist. It was just a few pages long run, those stories on it. I began touring the country talking about how to make your museum more family-friendly. I was a journalist. I was called in to see the then director of the National Gallery in London. I'll never forget this moment. When he, a communist, said, we really like this Kids Museums campaign and we've been talking on our board about it. We have some ideas of how we might work together, and I'd like you to take them back to your team.
Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the idea of the Industrial Revolution was that it was the work of some genius inventors who created machines used primarily in the textile industry, but also in mining that eliminated blocks to assembly line production. Then everybody was crowded into factories, and the new brave world opened up. In fact, one of the most interesting books and great classics that is still in print was written by an economic historian at Harvard who's still alive, called David Landis. It's a good book called The Unbound Prometheus, which is basically that. Some of the inventions that I briefly describe in your reading, the spinning jenny, etc., refer to that. Well, and that kind of analysis led one to concentrate on England, where the Industrial Revolution began, and to view industrialization as being a situation of winners and losers by not going as fast. Now, that analysis has been really rejected greatly over the past years, because Industrial Revolution is measured by more than simply large factories with industrial workers and the number of machines. This is the point of the beginning of this. The more that we look at the Industrial Revolution, the more that we see that the Industrial Revolution was first and foremost an intensification of forms of production, of kinds of production that were already there. And thus, we spend more time looking at, the intensification of artisanal production, craft production, of domestic industry, which we've already mentioned. That is, people, mostly women, but also men and children too, working in the countryside. The rapid rise of industrial production was very much tied to traditional forms of production.
Emery Lovins. Who knows who Emery Lovins is? Nobody. Emery Lovins is an unusual character. He's something of polymath, just to say he sort of soaks up knowledge across a wide range of fields. He's not an academic. He has a consulting company which he runs off until he recently out of his home in Colorado. He lives outside Snowmass in a house built into the side of a mountain that has no furnace. For about 30 years, he has been kind of iconic plastic oddball genius, thinking of ways to save energy, thinking of ways to solve problems using technology that already exist. And he has demonstrated several of them. He also is something that he's such an oddball that people tend to think he's kind of crazy. Anyway, Elizabeth Colbert went and spent some time with Emery Lovins, and so he's written this piece called Mr. Green.
People often forget their cards after taking money from the ATM. Occasionally, this is the common reason, because they get the money and walk away. In the UK, it becomes less common because people take their money after they've taken their card. In the past, people made the error by forgetting to get their cards after their money. UK has restructured the new ATM system. You have to get your card before you get your cash. Although you would forget to get your money, it is more catastrophic if you lose your card, because it can access your bank account. What is globalization? I think that it takes on a few different definitions in one sense of the word. Globalization means proliferation of transactions across country. So, one way of thinking about globalization is a way to describe increased international communications, more trade happening between countries and be less self-sufficient in providing goods and services to their people, and more companies that have offices in multiple countries, which we call multinationals. So the source of growth in travel and communication and corporate trade across borders. And this way of thinking about globalization is the continuation of thinking that has been around for a long time, such as when the Europeans went to the Orient to find spices, which was also an example of global trade and communication. Another way to think of globalization, though, is an economic system. It is a system in which countries become integrated in a way that never had been before. In this system, we see a global split in the process between consuming and producing goods. Some countries produce goods, some countries consume goods, and then these countries in different areas of the globe depend on each other in a kind of organic solidarity, rather than having an economic system being just inside your country. The system is the way economy in your country functions, depends on economy of another country. And in fact, this way of thinking about globalizations represents a new area of economic progression. The past industrialist economy has been a global issue.
The debt today is so high. It's 200,000 rupees. 300,000 rupees of peasants who have no capital. And they who know within a year or two, when they accumulate that kind of debt, they will never be able to pay back. Where is the debt coming from? It's coming from a seed that is costing 100,000 to 200,000 rupees per kilogram, depending on what you got. Seed that used to be free, used to be theirs. Pesticides each time, the more they use, the more they have to use. 12 sprays, 15 sprays, 20 sprays. Pesticide used in just the last 5 years in the large areas of India has shot up by 2,000%. That's why the free market and globalization have brought. And since we're talking about peasants who have no money, who have no capital, they can only buy expensive seeds and expensive pesticides by borrowing. And who lended that money? The same companies that sell the pesticides, which are the same companies that sell the seeds, as you know, are now also the major creditors.
Music and language. Both music and language have a lot of similarities. They involve complex sequences that unfold in time. They are both forms of communication. This has interested all the world's best philosophers from Plato going back over 2,000 years ago. Scientists like Darwin wrote about possible evolutionary links between music and language in his book The Descent of Man, and so did artists like Leonard Bernstein, who gave a series of lectures at Harvard in the 70s. He spoke about the grammar of language and the grammar of music from Noam Chomsky's theories, so it's a persistent question. It keeps drawing interest from scientists today, but there are some basic obvious similarities. For example, both music and language have rhythmic, systematic patterns of timing, accent, and grouping. Both language and music have melody-structured patterns of pitch over time. Both have syntax discrete elements like words or notes, and principles for combining those elements into sequences. Sentences are just random sequences of words. Both convey affect, which means emotion using sound. You can make out a lot of emotion from a person's voice, and music has the characteristic of providing emotions like happiness or sadness.
Okay, to understand what vitamin D does, we need to understand the central concept. The function of vitamin D is to maintain blood calcium. You probably think the function of vitamin D is to maintain strong bones and teeth, but it does that by accident. Its real function is to maintain your blood calcium level in a very narrow range. And the reason for that is if your blood calcium level falls below about 9 milligrams per 100 milliliters, then you're longing to be in a big trouble and die rather quickly. And that's because blood calcium is important for muscle contraction and nerve transmission. And if you don't have enough of it, you can't contract muscles normally. There can't be normal nerve impulses. And this results in a disease called tetany, where you get these uncontrolled convulsions followed by rapid death. Calcium is also important for enzymic activities and blood clotting.
I think there is an intense competition at the moment to hire the most talented and most intellectually able people. There is a time when I think companies have many of the adventures in the world. That involves the company's world. It was the boss's world. Now I think it reverses the case. We have a shortage in talent base within countries and between countries, have an intense battle between companies to hire the most talented workers, and also between countries, which are looking to recruit talented young people, talented young immigrants. We have this sense of immigrants being things that countries are battled to keep out, and immigrants want to get in, climb the walls. I think the opposite isn't the case. And the topic is that countries are trying to lure bright young people to get them to go to universities and get them to become immigrants. So on many levels, talent is a premium. There is a shortage of talent, and so countries, companies, all sorts of our organizations, of course, volunteer organizations as well, as are competing to hire the best and the brightest. You know, we have a baby boom population which is aging. We have an economy which is becoming more sophisticated. And so, for all those sorts of reasons, talent is a premium. That's it.
Laughter is one of the greatest therapies in combating adversity, and whole communities and nations have frequently relied on humor to get them through their bleakest times. On August 13, 1961, the barbed wire was rolled out of Berlin to create the Berlin Wall. For nearly 30 years, until it was dismantled, wall jokes proliferated, especially among those living in the East. Laughing was all that was left. It was a way of humanizing the tragedy of an ideology that had divided families and the nation. Wags would ask, "When does a good border guard fire the warning shot?" and answer with chilling wit, "At the end of the second clip of ammunition," thereby making light of the German Democratic Republicans' command to its border guards to shoot to kill anyone trying to cross the wall. Jokes about those who rule you, and sometimes those who tyrannize you, are a form of folklore that has existed in societies as seemingly different as communist in Eastern Europe, Tsarist Russia, modern Egypt, 12th century Persia, and modern-day Iran. Humor can also be wonderfully subversive. It can protect self-respect and identity.
There can be no reasonable science-based doubt about the reality of global climate change, effects brought on by the cumulative and rapidly growing emission of so-called greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. As these effects become increasingly more obvious worldwide, so commercial interests, groups of concerned individuals, and national governments have been gripped by what amounts to mass panic about what to do about it. To many, Paul Ehrlich's Malthusian population bomb of 1968 appears about to explode in the world's face in an indirect version of his millenarian vision of population growth, which outpaces agricultural production capacity, with predictably catastrophic results for humanity. And his three-part crisis scenario does indeed seem now to be present: a rapid rate of change, a limit of some sort, and delays in perceiving that limit. Ehrlich's work was roundly criticized at that time, and later from many quarters, and much of what he predicted did not come about. Nevertheless, can a world afford to take the risk that the climate scientists have got it wrong? Is it not in everyone's interests to apply the precautionary principle in attempting to avoid the worst of their predictions, now rather than at some future time? As the chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Mr. Rahendra Pukuri, has pointed out, 11 of the warmest years since instrumental records began have occurred in the past 12 years, while major precipitation changes are taking place on a global scale.
To understand the fight or flight response, it helps to think about the role of emotions in our lives. Many of us would prefer to focus on our logical, thinking nature and ignore our sometimes troublesome emotions, but emotions have a purpose. Our most basic emotions, like fear, anger, or disgust, are vital messengers. They evolved as signals to help us meet our basic needs for self-preservation and safety. It would be dangerous to be indecisive about a threat to our survival, so the brain runs information from our senses through the most primitive, reactive parts of our brain first. These areas of the brain control instinctive responses, and they don't do too much thinking. This most primitive part of our brain communicates with the rest of our brain and our body to create signals we can't ignore easily, powerful emotions and symptoms.
Today, a university like the LSE certainly has to acknowledge that it is in competition for the best students, all of whom have choices they can exercise, and many of them choices which run across national and continental borders. We are in competition, too, for staff. The academic job market is one of the most global there is, and in the 21st century, English is the new Latin, so universities in English-speaking countries are exposed to more intensive competition than those elsewhere. We are in competition for government funding through the assessment of research quality. We are in competition for research contracts from public and private sector sources, and indeed we are in competition for the philanthropic pound. Many of our own donors were at more than one university, and indeed think of the LSE's requests alongside those of other charities to which they are committed. That is the competitive environment which is particularly visible to a vice chancellor.
Within most developed countries, notions of pragmatism, notions of the fact that we have democracies, have succeeded in tempering the market economy. In the 19th century, 18th century, the Industrial Revolution had some very negative effects on people, particularly working classes all over the world. We see data where life expectancy was reduced, heights were reduced. We can look at medical records and see that actually living standards in among large fractions of the population actually went down. But eventually we passed legislation about working conditions, and eventually we circumscribed some of the worst kinds of behavior. We eventually, in the 20th century, we put regulations that imposed better environmental conditions. And so some of the damage was reversed, and that we have made the market economy work in ways that the benefits of it are at least far more widely shared than they were 100 years ago.
In my view, it's impossible not to talk about wildlife. and not think about its role in livelihoods. And I guess part of that is my own view, part of the research that I do in Africa. In most East and West Africa, I look at role all the humans rely on wildlife as the source of food and also the source of income. And we talk about our wildlife. It seems we talk about fish. We are talking about what is probably the single most important source of protein for humans across the globe. And so billions, or more than 1 billion people rely on fish as their primary source of animal protein. And most of these people live in poverty. So the management of wild fish resources, that sense, is incredibly important to livelihoods and health. And also, wildlife tourism is the multiple billion-dollar industry, and in many places, such as Africa, South America, it can be the #1 source of income. It can be the #1 source of foreign income for economies.
But you can see from the relatively crooked and narrow streets of the city of Rome as they look from above today, you can see that, again, the city grew in a fairly ad hoc way, as I mentioned. It wasn't planned all at once. It just grew up over time, beginning in the 8th century BC. Now, this is interesting because what we know about the Romans is when they were left to their own devices, and they could build a city from scratch, they didn't let it grow in an ad hoc way. They structured it in a very methodical way that was basically based on military strategy, military planning. The Romans, they couldn't have conquered the world without obviously having a masterful military enterprise, and they everywhere they went on their various campaigns, their various military campaigns, they would build camps, and those camps were always laid out in a very geometric plan along a grid, usually square or rectangular. So when we begin to see the Romans building their ideal Roman city, they turn to that so-called castrum, or military camp design.
One of the things that was going on during the Great Depression was the beginning of the sort of modern food technology that rules, the way Americans eat today. That is, there are a lot of canned foods were coming onto the market at the time, and also refrigerators were really becoming very, very popular during the Great Depression. Both in cities and in rural parts of the country, thanks to electrification, the Rural Electrification Administration. People could buy appliances, farmers could buy appliances, and that meant frozen foods were becoming big. At that time, few people could afford to buy them during the early years of the Great Depression, but, gradually these things picked up. And so this was like the sort of beginning of the era when people were starting to think about supermarkets with rows and rows of freezer cases and rows of canned foods.
Now, the study of biology is responsible for some of the most profounding insights that humans have about the world around them. So take a look at these 4 panoramas. In the upper left, you see some bacteria. This happen to be equal lines. You obviously see a butterfly, a flower, a dolphin. If you see that at the outer space just looks these different forms and structures, you have no idea that they were all related to one to another. So one of the most profound things that biology told us is that all life on Earth is exceptionally related similar to one to another. So for example, all of these life forms rely on DNA and RNA for storing and transmitting and using their genetic and inherited information. They are all based on cell. Cell is the fundamental building blocks of all life. All of these organisms consist of cells, and the cells essentially have the same chemicals inside of them: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and the whole bunch of other stuff in much smaller amount. All these organisms conducted metabolism, in other words, chemical reactions that using convert energy from one form to another. And the basic chemistry is all very similar to one and another. The types of molecule is used very similar to one and another.
Well, a historical linguist compares languages at several levels. You start out looking for basic vocabulary. All languages of the world, natural languages at least, have words for eye and head and nose and ear, and for sky and earth, and for water, sand, and for sibling, mother and father. They may not have words for uncle and aunt. It becomes much vaguer because in one culture an aunt is different when it comes from your father's side than from your mother's side. You don't include snow. Most people know what snow is, but in the tropics you don't have it. So you look for notions that are totally comparable and that occur everywhere in the world. You take the 100 or 200 most universal notions in a human life. That is what you call a basic vocabulary. So you take basic vocabularies in languages that you think are related. You look for words that sound the same.
Vitamin D version 2. So today we're going to finish talking about the fat-soluble vitamins. I'm going to start with vitamin D. And I think probably most of you know that vitamin D is called the sunshine vitamin. And it's called that because there's absolutely no dietary need for vitamin D if you get adequate sunshine. And the real important word there is it, because it turns out that in climates which aren't near the equator, there's a big question as to whether or not using these you get adequate sunshine. And that's important because foods are not naturally abundant in vitamin D. And that's why milk is fortified, but the fortification may not be enough. So again, just exposure to sunlight is adequate, no need for vitamin D. So vitamin D really isn't the vitamin, It's a pro-hormone when human beings evolve. We evolved in tropical climates and ran around naked. There was plenty of skin exposure to sunlight, and so there was no dietary need for vitamin D. As humans migrated away from that tropical regions, they actually created a need for vitamin D in food because sunlight was inadequate, particularly during the winter.
I suppose it's the truism to point out that citizens need to be well informed. Maybe it's something we take for granted in our liberal Western democracies, but there will be plenty of societies, well, that is run counter to explicit government policy. Many areas of the world still suffer from the reverie of the deliberate missing information. Governments, especially the unelected ones, but also some elected ones, have denied the events that have ever taken place. They pretend that other events did take place. They would help spin what they cannot deny, and sure they've used every trick of the book to pull the eyes of the world and in an attempt to cover up their mistakes.
For thousands of years, philosophers and astronomers, and thinkers of all sorts, have imagined that the universe, the space around us, was rather like this floor in front of us. It was fixed and unchangeable, and things happen on it, just as people walk around. So the stars, the comets, and the planets, and the other heavenly bodies moved around and traced down their parts on this completely unchanging stage of space. In the 20th century, as the result of Einstein's work, that view of the universe was completely transformed. We began to understand that there was no absolutely fixed stage of space at all on which all celestial notions were played out. But in some sense, on the larger scale in the universe, the space itself was in this state of a continuous dynamic change. That was a prediction made by Einstein. However, Einstein was not the first person to propose the theory, and the theory was proposed by an astronomer called Hubble in the 1920s.
Globalization is an overused and often misunderstood concept. We hear it all the time on news broadcasts and in any type of public discussion. But the starting point for understanding globalization is that it is industries and markets that globalize, not countries. That's why it's helpful to think of globalization as the integration of economic activities across borders. But why does globalization matter? I would argue globalization matters because it means the rise of interconnectedness between countries and markets across the world. For example, one of the reasons why the financial crash of 2007 to 2008 was so serious was because the financial and banking systems of countries around the world have become so closely interconnected with the globalization of markets. What's the literal definition of risk? Business schools use risk analysis. So what do you mean by risk? And we need a dictionary. When you look at dictionary, this is literal definition of risk. What it says is, the definition, for example, the possibility of injury, a dangerous element or factor, chance of, degree or possibility of such loss, and so on. So risk has two parts, as you look at the literal definition of risk. One part is the consequence of some kind of particular danger, hazard loss, and the other is about the probability of it, chance and consequence, okay? And then at least just as English language concerns, when you look up the word of safe and safety, what you'll earn as, it's a little bit of a loop, a little circular argument that free from harm or risks, secure from danger, harm or loss, the condition of being safe, and so on for all. And why we take out of it. At least when we talk about safe, at least in English language, we are talking absolute something is safe, or it sounds safe.
There are two main categories of memory. Implicit memory, which is also called procedural memory, cannot be consciously recalled. It is an experimental or functional form of memory, informed by cultural and social background. With implicit memory, behaviors are automatic. We recall implicit memories naturally, so we are not aware when we are using them. Examples of implicit memory include using languages naturally, driving automatically, reading and writing. When people try to consciously describe how to drive, they may misrepresent how they actually drive. What we often describe as bad memory is explicit memory. Explicit memory is also known as episodic memory, which is totally different from implicit memory. It's more about time and space, and is often related to personal life experiences. Some examples of explicit memory include remembering birthdays from many years ago, or answering multiple choice questions in a test. One of the most amazing things that's happened even in my lifetime is the prediction of cosmology. When I started out 40-odd years ago, we thought we knew that the universe began a Big Bang. Some people doubted even then. We thought the universe was about 10 or 20 billion years old. But now, for really very sound scientific reasons, we can say that the universe did start it in a Big Bang, and it's 13.8 billion years old. So it's not 14, it's not 13, because a decimal point in there, and that's a stunning achievement to know that. And we also know that the laws of physics that apply to tiny particles inside atoms also explains what happened in the Big Bang. You can't have one without the other. A very neat example of this is that when you apply nuclear physics, that kind of physics to understand how stars work, you find out that the oldest star in the universe is about 13 billion years old. So their universe is just a little bit older than the stars. Fantastic! If we'd done it and counted in the other way around, and said that the stars were older than the universe, we would say science were in deep trouble. But it's not. Everything fits together, and we know how the universe began. We got to know how the way it is. The future, that it'll suspects we don't know quite well what's going, but we got some ideas, which are as good as those ideas we had 40 years ago about how Big Bang happened. Now we would like to look at a recent survey conducted by Canadian researchers on diet. Total 31 women volunteered in the survey. They have been told to participate in the exercise program without changing their diet. After a careful observation, the researchers found that some volunteers experienced a body fat change after 6 months from the day they have started the experiment. The findings further stated that some lost significant amount of fat, which led to decrease in body mass. On the other hand, there were others who did not lose fat at all. The study concludes that there must be two explanations. Those who did not lose weight must have eaten more, and another factor is that it is because there is psychological reason not to believe in losing fat.
So various conclusions. Yes, bees are in decline. These declines are well documented. They are real and reported by good, strong scientific evidence. It is the only evidence that counts. The drives to decline are many. They are varied depending on species. The fact of pollinator loss could be absolutely huge. So, is it a catastrophe? Not yet, but it could be. On the positive side, we're aware of the problem, aware this is being raised with time, and people are taking actions fast. We've recognized the problem, and that, at least, is being done.
Consumers are the core section of any business. In fact, the whole concept of any business is surrounded by the behavior of consumers, and the values of consumer is a crucial factor. Now, we have to understand a consumer is not to be taken lightly. He knows what product he wants. Consumers are extremely smart. They could make decisions about price and value of products in minutes or sometimes in few seconds. So, a business therefore needs to uplift its brand image. Consumers are willing to pay $15 more for quality product. products. However, the conflict starts when manufacturers fail to meet the expectations. This lies in the basic fundamental of engineering in designing a product. Consumers want products to be softest, but at the same time, they also want product like toilet papers to be light and strong, something which can be easily be torn. The brand Tide is really good example. There was a problem of shaking the washing powder before being put into the machine as it caused the damage the material of the clothes. Tide had to made up to a lot of expectations for consumers.
But what are the dangers of keeping these drugs at home? There are a number of dangers. Parents should know that leftover drugs are dangerous because they may be accidentally ingested by children. Either adults don't keep the bottles properly closed and stored, or because even many kids can sometimes open child-proof lids. Patients may use the drugs after their expiration date. The leftover drugs may be taken for the wrong reasons. For example, someone may have a viral infection and self-prescribe to leftover into microbial that was prescribed for a bacterial infection. But that drug will have no effect as the viral infections. Drugs that are left over might be given to or taken by someone else who may have a serious allergy to the medicine, and who for that reason would not be prescribed to medicine under the supervision of a physician. Finally, inappropriate use of drugs promotes drug resistance if the drug is taken for the wrong indication, the wrong duration, or in the wrong dosage. Todd, what can people do about this? How can the situation be improved? I think physicians, patients, and parents of patients can take steps to improve the situation. First of all, physicians should prescribe the drug only when appropriate, only in the correct amount, and only for the correct duration. Also, the physician must stress to the patient that the full course of the drug must be taken. This is recommended even if symptoms resolve before the end of the prescription, and parents of children on antibiotics need to ensure they complete their course as well.
The Human Rights Act can be seen as far-reaching and some would argue controversial in the UK history of rights. At the same time, it can be described as a somewhat cautious document that provides the starting point for wider application of the law to rights. In many ways, the freedoms and protections contained within the Human Rights Act were not new to people living in the UK. The output of the UK law influenced most of the clauses in the European Convention on Human Rights. The convention itself was devised following the end of the Second World War by the Council of Europe. UK lawyers played a significant role in the drafting of the convention, and the UK was among the first governments to ratify the convention in 1951. Rights are sometimes described as being of a positive or negative nature. That's to say, some can be expressed as a right to, and others is freedom from. The 1998 Act put into place 15 specific rights and freedoms, which include rights to liberty and security, a free trial, free expression, free elections, and the right to marry and found a family. There are also freedoms from torture, from slavery or forced labor, and from discrimination on grounds such as race, sex, religion. political opinion, or social origin. The Human Rights Act has been described as the start of a process. The Act itself does not expand on the provisions made by the European Convention, which some would consider as following a baseline or minimum standards for human rights.
Well, it's like, why is Australian housing is so expensive? Essentially, it's showing of how well the Australian economy has been doing over the last 15 years. We've had 15 years more or less of an uninterrupted economic growth during which average earning has been raised by close to 90%, while over the course of that period, the standard variable mortgage rate was halved. That meant that the amount which a typical home-buying household can afford to borrow under rules which aren't strictly applied, as they used to be, had more than doubled. Over the same period, rising immigration and falling average household size has meant that the number of households looking for accommodation has risen by about 1.5 million. That's around 200,000 more than the number of dwellings has increased by. So you have had a substantial increase in the purchasing power of households. No net increase in the supply of housing, and hence all that addition purchasing power has gone into pushing up the price of housing.
Well, the 90s came around and finally it clicked that normal people could get online, which hadn't really clicked before. And the little trick that finally put it together was Tim Berners-Lee HTML. So thank you to the UK for providing the fellow who finally put the missing chink in place. And then what happened in the 90s was this extraordinary outpouring of creativity and constructiveness from millions and millions of people. There were millions of people making web pages, creating content online, creating social experiments, creating lessons, all sorts of things. And the first decade of the web took place without much of a profit motive, without any particular charismatic figures driving it, without fear, without a desire for an afterlife or any other religious gambits, without advertising, without any of the traditional motivational schemes. It simply happened because people enjoyed it and it was a good idea.
So the topic for today is abstraction. And this is a very important layer of computer, because you can't do anything with a computer unless you have a symbolic system in place. Right, so we're talking about the origin of symbolic systems. Language is a classic symbolic system. Apparently, one theory for why language evolved is that people communicated with sign language and with movement quite well for a long time. And it turned out that they wanted to communicate even while they were doing things. So while they were trying to strangle the dinosaur, not the dinosaurs, the rhinoceros, They wanted to say, "Come help me," and they used sign language to do it. They had to let go the rhinoceros, and the rhinoceros ran away. So you can see that it's a good idea to be able to do something with your hands and be able to communicate at the same time. Hence words and language.
What we know is that the impact of the pandemic world would be catastrophic if it is similar to what we had in 1918. In the United States, there has been unprecedented amount of preparation so far. It affects every aspect of public health. We have efforts for treatment, efforts for better prevention, clinical management, key communications, the domestic and international responses, and also efforts to try to prevent transmission within community. The federal government has had tremendous amount of resources that they have put into development of the new antiviral drug stockpiles, development of new vaccines, and manufacturing facilities for vaccines. So there's quite a lot that's happening in the United States. However, developing countries do not have the level of resources found in more developed countries. That's the real challenge.
London architecture. It seems to me that architecture is very much something that causes us both pleasure and trouble. I live in the part of Western London where I think many of the streets are. Where I live are really, really ugly. And this distresses me every time I walk to a supermarket or walk to a tube. I think, why did they build that? And terribly without architecture. It lasts so long, and if you write a bad book or do a bad play, I will be shocked when it be showed, and then no one would suffer. A bad building has a serious impact could be hundreds of years on the people around it. And suppose the book arose a little bit from the frustration, almost anger, then there is so much bad architecture around. And then I realize if you talk about architecture, you will say, why buildings are not more beautiful? Then you will say, I can use such work as beauty. That's a really arrogant word. And no one knows what beautiful is. It's all in the eye of beholder. I couldn't help but think that actually, that we all attempt to agree that Rome is nice than Milky Kings, and San Francisco has the edge of Frankfurt. So we can make that sort of generalization. Surely there are some things we can say about why a building works or why it doesn't. So the books really attempt to suggest why architecture works when it does, and what might going to be wrong when it doesn't work. So happiness economics can help us get to these questions, and I'll try to give you some examples of this. Now, even though there's a lot of skepticism originally about using this surveys what people say make them happy, the number of reasons that we are getting increasingly confident in doing so. One is that their consistent pattern, remarkable consistent pattern, that determines well-being across large samples of people, across countries, across the world, and over time. Some of the basic things that make people happy, and I will show you some of these: income, health, marital status, employment status. Some of these very basic things are remarkably consistent across countries, across world. So that gives us some sense that these surveys are picking up consistent patterns. And when we know what consistent patterns are, we can look how other things that very much more affect people's well-being. The environment and equality, the nature's institution raging on living, and all kinds of other things that very much more. Last week we talked about how people recognize objects, and really how well people recognize objects, given how difficult the problem is, given how objects can be seen in all different sorts of illumination, in different positions, in different angles. And yet we are able to extract that information. We are able to take the visual stuff out there, interpret it in a way that allows us to recognize all the different things that we can in our environment. Today we're going to kind of carry on looking at that, but we're going to look at what's really a special class of objects. That's the human face. So we're going to look at how we recognize human faces, and how we do it quite as well as we do. We're really expert at recognizing faces. So again, we can think about how do we take that visual information, and how do we transform it into a form which allows us to put a name to a face, and to do all the other clever things that we can do with faces. So I'm going to start off again by just pointing out that it's a hard problem. Face recognition is a hard problem, and it's a clever thing we do. If you think about all the different types of faces you can recognize, and all the different types of information you can get from the face, you kind of start to appreciate how well we can do face recognition. Mars is fourth planet from the Sun, and the second smallest planet in the solar system after Mercury. named after the Roman god of the war. It is often referred to as a red planet because the iron oxide prevalent on its surface gives it a reddish appearance. Mars is a terrestrial planet with a thin atmosphere, having surface features reminiscent both of the impact crater of the Moon and the volcanoes, valleys, deserts, and polar ice caps of the Earth. The rotational period and the season cycles of the Mars are likewise similar of those of Earth, as it was the tilt that produced the seasons. Mars is the site of the Olympus Mons, the largest volcano and the second largest known mountain in the solar system, and the Valles Marineris, one of the largest canyon in the solar system. Until the first successful Mars flyby in 1965 by Mariner 4, many speculated about the presence of the liquid water on the planet's surface. This was based on observed periodic variation in the light and the dark patches, particularly in the polar latitude, which appeared to be seas and continents. Geological evidence gathered by the unmanned mission suggested that Mars once had large scale of water coverage on the surface on some earlier stages of existence.
The design of buildings is important according to architectural textbooks. At its roots, architecture exists to create the physical environment in which people live. But architecture is more than just the built environment. It's also a part of our culture. It stands as a representation of how we see ourselves, as well as how we see the world. There are poorly designed buildings, but also some great building works. In the Victorian era, architects designed buildings based on bricks and other materials. The design of floors was based on lighting, as it would not only affect appearance but also health conditions. The materials that buildings are made of also matter. For example, the design of ground floors must ensure that the building is able to withstand the weight of the higher levels. In the 20th century, many old buildings with design floors were demolished or modified through a natural selection process, which means they are an altered state rather than an original state. This is an application of Darwin's theory of natural selection to modification of old buildings, which means buildings should adapt to the new world to survive or be pulled down. So, it's argued to be unfair to criticize the demolition, although some people believe that whether to be remain should be decided based on their nature and functions. As the world became more and more connected, the styles evolve, but even in modern construction, there is still an importance in honoring the cultural nuances in the built environment.
English, as you have already read, is not a pure language. I don't think there really are any pure languages in the world. But English is definitely not a pure language. English, in fact, has borrowed from over 350 languages in its history. So it's a variety of many languages. Some people say it's like a dog, a mongrel dog, a dog that has been made up of many different dogs. The English language is like that. By looking at the history of the English language, we learn about the history of the English people. The two things are closely connected. So, in fact, today we are not only learning about language, but we are learning about history. The fact that English has borrowed words from over 350 languages has been viewed differently throughout history. So, for example, in Shakespeare's time, people were not very angry about words which were not, they thought, original English words, words which came from other languages. They didn't like them. English, as you have already read, is not a pure language. I don't think there really are any pure languages in the world. But English is definitely not a pure language. English, in fact, has borrowed from over 350 languages in its history. So it's a variety of many languages. Some people say it's like a dog, a mongrel dog, a dog that has been made up of many different dogs. The English language is like that. By looking at the history of the English language, we learn about the history of the English people. The two things are closely connected. So, in fact, today we are not only learning about language, but we are learning about history. The fact that English has borrowed words from over 350 languages has been viewed differently throughout history. So, for example, in Shakespeare's time, people were not very angry about words which were not, they thought, original English words, words which came from other languages. They didn't like them.
A fast radio burst is very much like what it sounds. It's a burst. It's a very fast burst of radio waves. It comes from outer space, a long way away. And by fast, I mean really fast. So it starts and stops in about 1,000th of a second. So you click your fingers and it's finished. Fast radio bursts are a real mystery. We don't really understand exactly where they come from or what actually makes them. And there's a lot of open questions that we really don't have an answer for. There are probably more theories about what makes fast radio bursts than there are actual detections of these things. So since 2007 we've only had 20, but there are probably 30 or 40 different theories on what makes them. The most interesting thing about this burst is the fact that we found it with the Australian Square Kilometre Array Pathfinder. So that is, it wasn't really obvious that we would be able to do this as well as we ended up being able to do it. So this telescope is really a fantastic telescope. In fact, it's probably the best telescope on the planet at the moment for finding these bursts. And so whereas in the past it's taken 10 years to find 20 bursts, once we're really going with this new instrument, we'll be able to find them much more quickly, one or two every week. And that will blow open the field, so that will make it a much more, we'll be able to do much more detailed studies of these things, get better statistics, hopefully understand what they are and where they're coming from. So I think the thing that's most interesting about this burst is the fact that it heralds a new era, not only for the telescope, but for the whole field, where we'll be able to actually have lots more things to play with. That's probably the most important thing. I liken it a little bit like the Sauron of space, the all-seeing eye, because we see so much of the sky in comparison with other telescopes. We really can catch these things really easily. When you can find a whole bunch very quickly, which is what we can do now with the Australian Square Kilometre Array Pathfinder, we'll be able to get a nice uniform set that we can start to do some statistics with. So a classic thing we can do is measure how many really bright ones there are versus how many faint ones, and that tells us whether the things that we're looking at come from fairly nearby or really far away in the universe, much further than we might even think.
Shakespeare's poem. Let's think about perhaps the top 10 things that people would like to know, ought to know about Shakespeare if they're getting into his works. The first thing to say is that he did live quite a long time ago. He lived 400 years ago. So if you're reading Shakespeare or listening to Shakespeare, you're listening to somebody whose language is not quite the language of our current. You're listening to someone who was writing in a language which is a bit out of date for now. It needs a little bit of effort to understand that language, but the understanding will be done partly for you by the actors if you're hearing it, if you're seeing it performed. Another thing is that Shakespeare was a very great poet. He wrote poems are at narrative poems and sonnets, but he was also, and this is my third point, he was also a great theater poet. His poetry is dramatic poetry in the plays. He's not just writing static poetry, lyric poetry in the plays, which is therefore declamation. He's writing dramatic poetry, which consists of interaction between the characters of the plays.
Look, I'm going to talk today really mostly about what I do as a curator here at the National Museum, but I want to try and draw some kind of generalities from that in terms of how there's a series of curatorial practices, if you like, tools and techniques and methods that I think could be of interest to your students and of interest to you in developing extension history courses. I want to talk about what I do as a curator, and then from that also talk a little bit about the kinds of history that I think museums are particularly good at creating and communicating. I think this is something I'd really like to discuss because I think it's not necessarily very well understood that museums, as Dave insisted by putting up my quote at the beginning of in his slide, is that I think museums create a very particular kind of history. It's not the kind of history that gets created in books or indeed in films or in compositions. It's a very particular kind of history that grows out of the fact that museums are centrally interested and defined by their collections. I should say that's not an uncontested view of museums, but it's certainly my view of museums. So curators try to understand material culture as evidence of other people's lives, as a means to try to understand other people, what they looked like, what they did, how they made a living, what they hoped for in their lives, how they tried to construct their world, and why they made particular choices. And one way in which curators differ from other historians is therefore in focus in terms of how we interrogate the past, what elements we use to communicate the past. Most academic historians are trained very much in the discipline of words, and they concentrate on words. Still today, I think, although it's changing a little bit. If you go through university history, I think primarily you are encouraged to draw on things like archival accounts, manuscripts, now oral histories, and most of that work is actually promulgated in the form of books. There's also other kinds of historians. Obviously, filmmakers and photographers concentrate on creating images of the world and arranging them in meaningful sequences. But curators attend to objects. We look at objects as evidence of the past and try to arrange objects in meaningful ways called exhibitions.
Well, who makes these decisions? In the international arena, the decisions are made by states, but to George Orwell's phrase, some states are more equal than others. The ones who are most equal are the ones called G7, the 7 rich industrial countries, and they have an overwhelming effect on states' decisions. And of G7, the one that's far and away the most equal is, of course, the United States, which, since the Second World War, has had a position of overwhelming international power, historical precedent to then, and of course, has used it to design a world and the interests of powerful sectors within. Alongside the powerful states, there are the institutions that they have designed, the international financial institutions, the IMF from World Bank's World Trade Organization, took over from GAP a couple of years ago. Those are institutions of global dominant, global control, which are themselves controlled by the rich countries and primarily by the United States, which, once again, has an overwhelming influence. So faults are breaks in the Earth crust. We can identify them because of the discontinuity in the structure within the Earth crust across fault. and earthquake occur on these faults, so very processes by which these faults moves to a large extent is due to earthquakes. So we have a fault plane, and the earthquake is so focused on this fault plane, and the earthquake starts at the particular point on the fault plane, and we call that the focus of the earthquake. The rock prorogates out from that point on the rupture plane to cover the entire fault plane. The rupture is in that particular earthquake. We talked about the epicenter of the earthquake a lot. The epicenter is just the surface projection of the focus of the earthquake. So if you wanted to looking at map view where the earthquake was located, we would be able to look that into the earth. We would see the focus down some depth in the earth, or the epicenter, just a point vertically above that focus at the surface of the earth. So this is the focus between the faults and the earthquakes. The war for talent refers to an increasingly competitive landscape for recruiting and retaining talented employees. In the book, Michaels et al. Describe not a set of superior human resources processes, but a mindset that emphasizes the importance of talent to the success of organizations. The war for talent is intensified by demographic shifts, primarily in the United States and Europe. This is characterized by increasing demand along with decreasing supply demographically. There are simply fewer post-baby boom workers to replace the baby boom retirement in the US and Europe, though this is not the case in most of East Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Central America, South America, or the Middle East. Eastern Europe also tends to have similar demographics, namely an aging and shrinking labor force. While talent is vague or ill-defined, the underlying assumption is that for knowledge-intensive industries, the knowledge worker is the key competitive resource. Knowledge-based theories of organizations consistently place knowledge workers as a primary competitive resource. Talent is never explicitly defined in the book, though the preface notes, a certain part of talent elude description. You simply know it when you see it. After several further caveats, the authors go on. We can say, however, that managerial talent is some combination of a sharp strategic mind, leadership ability, emotional maturity, communication skills, the ability to attract and inspire other talented people, entrepreneurial instincts, functional skills, and the ability to deliver results. The authors offer no outside support for this assertion. A 2006 article in The Economist, which mentions the book, notes that companies do not even know how to define talent, let alone how to manage it. Some use it to mean people like Aldous Huxley's alphas in Brave New World, those at the top of the bell curve. Others employ it as a synonym for the entire workforce, a definition so broad as to be meaningless. The war for talent is seen by various sources as becoming irrelevant during economic downturns. However, there have been highly visible talent poaching by solvent firms of others who have economic hardship. John Milton is best known for his poetry, especially Paradise Lost, but also for the more accessible and shorter Lycidas and L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, plus one or two sonnets you will find in most anthologies. But an easier way into what he thought and believed in social and political terms is through his prose writings. These were mostly pamphlets and tracts, written in reaction to some political event or situation, but also included pamphlets on a wide variety of subjects, including at least 4 on divorce, which for him was tied up with personal freedom. However, the text which has probably had the most relevance down the years, and which can be read with profit, is the Areopagitica, which is a defense of freedom of expression and publication, and against censorship. It was written as a reaction to an attack on himself, in particular a pamphlet on divorce he had written, and which some condemned as a wicked book.
The question today of what makes a luxury brand and how do we distinguish it is very hard to answer. The standard business response is to say they are more exclusive, and we get exclusivity by having high price and relatively small amounts of the product available. The reality, however, of luxury brands is that they are sold in their millions and in some cases are not priced that much higher than the standard output. The only way I can really answer your question is to say it is all relative. As you said in your introduction, it wasn't that long ago in Australia that we would have considered 2 televisions to be a luxury, or even further back, 1-color television. And you can make a strong argument. For example, that Starbucks in China right now is a luxury purchase because of its cost, because of how frequently it is purchased by many people. So, I think the long answer is a complicated one, but the answer is, it depends who you talk to. I think in the business community what we would say is that there is a small cluster of more expensive brands which have a distinct strategy that we would identify as being luxury brands. And they start with the Rolls-Royces and the Tiffany's and the Louis Vuittons of the world. And I think that tends to be how we see them. Today, this course you are going to take is about what is engineering and how to work with a complicated system. You guys should know the answers because all of you guys are from the engineering course, especially when you design, build, debug, and develop something new. During this process, you are working with the complicated system, how to program complicated systems, and how would you know it actually works before producing it. Sometimes the inspirations are from your daily life. You probably need to consider your personal life experience, and from the common everyday life to the tiny things that you cannot see virtually, and the inspirations normally exist in the tiny levels. A complicated system such as your laptops running Microsoft systems. That means the system is not able to see, which means you guys have to virtualize it. Engineering is here to help virtualize by using systems. Nowadays, the complicated systems are relatively reliable, and you guys work upon these and need to deliver the new outcomes which are reliable as well. This is what we do now and we are good at. Engineering is to help virtualize by using systems. In order to develop and produce a reliable system, you need consider more on the risks, potentials, predictability and accuracy. The first inhabitants in Australia were the ancestors of the present Indigenous people. Whether these first migrations involved one or several successive waves and distinct peoples is still subject to academic debate, as is its timing. The minimum widely accepted time frame places presence of humans in Australia at 40,000 to 43,000 years before present, while the upper range supported by others is 60,000 to 70,000 years BP. In any event, this migration was achieved during the closing stages of the Pleistocene epoch, when sea levels were typically much lower than they are today. Repeated episodes of extended glaciation resulted in decreases of sea levels by some 100,150 m. The continental coastline therefore extended much further out into the Timor Sea than it does today, and Australia and New Guinea formed a single landmass, known as Sahel, connected by an extensive land bridge across the Arafura Sea, Gulf of Carpentaria and Torres Strait. The ancestral Australian Aboriginal peoples were thus long established and continued to develop, diversify and settle through much of the continent. As the sea levels again rose at the terminus of the most recent glacial period some 10,000 years ago, the Australian continent once more became a separated landmass. However, the newly formed 150 km wide Torres Strait with its chain of islands still provided the means for cultural contact and trade between New Guinea and the northern Cape York Peninsula. During the 1970s and 1980s, around 120,000 Southern Asian refugees migrated to Australia. During that 20 years, Australia first began to adopt a policy of what Minister of Immigration Al Grasby termed multiculturalism. In 2004-05, Australia accepted 123,000 new settlers, a 40% increase over the past 10 years. The largest number of immigrants, 40,000 in 200,405, moved to Sydney. The majority of immigrants came from Asia, led by China and India. Why the bumblebees pick some flowers over others. Researchers have known for a while that flowers' color can be a signal. Color in shorthand that says to a bee, "Hey, I get some good quality nectar here. Want to stop by for a visit?" But new findings show that bees also use color to get clues about a flower's temperature. And according to a study from a British research team published in the journal Nature, some like it hot. Bees use up a lot of energy just staying warm on some days. In fact, They can't even fly if they are too cold. So if one flower is warmer than another, a bee can save some of its fuel by basking on that flower while it's doing its pollinating business. And it turns out that bumblebees consistently do choose warmer flowers over cooler ones, even when the two flowers offer up the same quantity and quality of nectar. Some plants seem to be evolutionarily adapted to be slightly warmer because the warmer ones get visited more by the chilly bees. When it comes to getting pollinated, apparently the heat is on, and that is the boss. Let me start with the brain and the functions of learning and memory. Because what we've discovered over the past 10 or so years is that you need sleep after learning to essentially hit the save button on those new memories so that you don't forget. But recently, we discovered that you also need sleep before learning to actually prepare your brain, almost like a dry sponge ready to initially soak up new information. And without sleep, the memory circuits of the brain essentially become waterlogged, as it were, and you can't absorb new memories. I think we are in the early stages of a change toward much more human freedom in business, and I think this change may be as important for businesses as the change to democracy has been for governments. The reason I think that's happening is because it's now possible for the first time in human history to have the economic benefits of very large organizations. Things like economies of scale and knowledge, and at the same time to have the human benefits of small organizations. Things like freedom, flexibility, creativity, and motivation. The reason I think that's possible is because information technology has now reduced the cost of communication to such a low level that it's now possible for huge numbers of people, even in very large organizations, to have enough information to make sensible decisions for themselves, instead of just following orders from someone above them who supposedly knows more than they do in a management hierarchy.
Introducing your persuasive essay. Hook your audience. There are many different types of leads or hooks that you can use to begin your persuasive essay. A good introduction, remember, has a few functions, including grabbing the reader's attention, introducing the topic and your position, and previewing the main points of your essay. Let's look at a few examples of ways to hook a reader. A news lead sounds like a newspaper article because you simply state the facts: who, what, where, how, and why. An anecdote or short story tells the story of a real person directly impacted by the topic of your essay, like a child soldier or a child slave in the tobacco fields. A question can get the reader thinking about your topic. Reader identification is another kind of hook that shows the reader how the story relates to them. A shocking fact or statistic can surprise a reader and make him or her want to read more. Guided imagery is where you use your best descriptive five-sense skills and transport the reader into the world that you are describing. Dialogue allows the story to unfold through conversation of main characters. Remember, whatever hook or lead idea you use, it should be something new and not a cliche or overused expression. Be bold and make a statement to get your reader to feel emotion or be shocked into wanting to learn more.